Welcome to Behind Closed Cases. I'm Detective Tom Hayes, and today we're diving into one of the most unsettling cases I've ever encountered. A case that began with a tragic accident, but quickly turned into a mystery that no one saw coming. Our story begins in the quiet town of Oakwood, a place where people know each other's names, where friendships run deep, and life moves at a slower pace. It was in this peaceful town that Daniel Grayson, one of Oakwood's most respected men, was found dead at the bottom of his own grand staircase. People said it was an accident, a simple misstep in the night, the kind of tragedy no one questions. But as I looked closer, the details didn't quite add up. Daniel wasn't the type to be careless. He was known for his careful routines, his steady habits. He'd walked that staircase countless times. Yet here he was, lying cold at the bottom of it. Something about the scene just didn't sit right with me. Then there was his widow, Helen Grayson. She was composed at the funeral, a little too composed. Dressed in black, she accepted condolences with a quiet poise, never a tear out of place. To some, it might have seemed like dignity, but to me, it seemed like distance, detachment. It wasn't long after that we got a call from her. She was filing an insurance claim on Daniel's policy. The amount was substantial, more than enough to support her comfortably for years. I remember her voice on the phone, calm and cold as she explained the paperwork, and then she said something I couldn't shake. "Detective Hayes, I would like this process to be handled quickly. Daniel wouldn't want me suffering through any unnecessary delays." Maybe I was reading too much into it, but the way she spoke made me uneasy. To her, it seemed like Daniel's death was just a task to get through. That's when my doubts began to surface. Something about Helen's urgency, her controlled grief. It all felt wrong. So I decided to take a second look at Daniel's case. We pulled the file and revisited the evidence with fresh eyes, knowing that sometimes the truth hides just below the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to dig a little deeper. As I went back to the crime scene, something caught my attention. Bruising on Daniel's arms and shoulders. It was subtle, easy to overlook, but it suggested that he might have struggled, maybe tried to brace himself before the fall. This wasn't just a routine check. I could feel it in my gut. We were about to uncover something much darker. And as I left the precinct that evening, I knew one thing for sure. Daniel Grayson's death wasn't the accident it seemed. Join me as we go behind closed doors to uncover secrets no one was ever meant to find. When I reopened the case, I went back to the scene of Daniel Grayson's death with fresh eyes. His estate was silent, as if it held its breath. Still reeling from the tragedy, I found myself standing at the base of that grand staircase, picturing his final moments, the exact path he might have taken, the fateful misstep. But the image in my mind didn't line up with what I saw. Bruises, subtle, faint, but unmistakable on his forearms and shoulders. They weren't the sort of injuries one would expect from a simple fall. It was more as if he had struggled, perhaps with someone. My suspicions grew as I thought of Helen Grayson again, her unflinching calm, her cool composure, and her rush to file the insurance claim. For a widow grieving her husband, she was moving quickly, too quickly. And yet, there was something so calculated in her actions, almost rehearsed. I decided to pay Helen a visit at the Grayson estate, hoping to gain a clearer picture of what life had been like behind these walls. The house was immaculate, almost eerily so, as if untouched by grief. Helen greeted me with her usual poise, offering tea in a flawless porcelain cup, and as we sat, I took in every detail. The way she held herself, the way her eyes avoided mine when I mentioned Daniel's name. "Detective Hayes," she said, her voice level, "I hope this investigation will be brief. I'm not sure I have the strength to go through it all again." But as she spoke, there was something strange in her expression, a flicker of something she quickly concealed. Was it discomfort, guilt, or something more? I asked her about the night Daniel died, hoping to catch any inconsistencies. She recounted it with such precision, every detail seemingly perfect, rehearsed even. According to her, Daniel had been drinking, something unusual for him. He'd been agitated, pacing, and later, as he headed to bed, she heard a crash. When she found him, he was already gone. Her story was tight, almost too tight, and as I left that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that Helen Grayson was hiding something, a part of her story that she didn't want anyone to see. As I closed the case file for the day, I knew one thing for sure. Daniel Grayson's death wasn't as simple as a tragic accident. There was more to uncover, and I was only just beginning. Stay tuned as we dig deeper into Helen's past, Daniel's secrets, and the dark truths hidden within the walls of the Grayson estate. With doubts growing about Helen Grayson, I began to wonder what might be lurking in her past. In my experience, people don't just wake up one day and decide to cover up a murder, if that's what this was. There are usually hints, signs, little fragments of a personality that reveal themselves under pressure. So I started digging. The first thing that caught my attention was that Helen hadn't always been Helen Grayson. Before she married Daniel, she'd been Helen Boyd, a name that didn't ring any bells around Oakwood. It turned out she'd moved here shortly before meeting Daniel. I reached out to her hometown, a small city a few hours away, and asked about her background. What I found was more than a little concerning. Helen's first husband, Richard Boyd, had also died under strange circumstances, drowned in a lake on a weekend camping trip. The incident had been ruled an accident, but there were whispers, stories from people who knew Richard and Helen. Some claimed that the couple had been on the verge of separation, while others mentioned that Richard's family suspected something foul, but couldn't prove it. When Helen inherited a sizable life insurance payout, she left town, moved to Oakwood, and within a year married Daniel Grayson. The similarities between Richard's death and Daniel's were too much to ignore. Both were well-off men who trusted her implicitly, and both were gone, leaving her with substantial financial gain. I felt a chill run down my spine. Had Helen orchestrated not just one but two accidental deaths? But I needed more. Rumors and suspicions wouldn't be enough to build a case, especially against someone as composed and poised as Helen. I would need hard evidence, something that tied her directly to Daniel's death. So I retraced my steps, going over every detail from that night. The staircase, the bruising, the strange calm in Helen's voice when she reported his fall. I decided to talk to Daniel's friends and family, hoping someone might have noticed something that could give us a clearer picture of his final days. The more I uncovered, the more unsettling the story became. Daniel had been distant, distracted. He'd confided in his brother about something that didn't feel right at home, but had brushed it off as stress. Whatever had been haunting Daniel before his death, I was determined to find it. And as I went back through those case files, I knew I was getting closer to the truth. Join me next time as we delve into Daniel's personal life and uncover the secrets he kept hidden, secrets that may have cost him everything. With doubts growing about Helen Grayson, I began to wonder what might be lurking in her past. In my experience, people don't just wake up one day and decide to cover up a murder, if that's what this was. There are usually hints, signs, little fragments of a personality that reveal themselves under pressure. So I started digging. The first thing that caught my attention was that Helen hadn't always been Helen Grayson. Before she married Daniel, she'd been Helen Boyd, a name that didn't ring any bells around Oakwood. It turned out she'd moved here shortly before meeting Daniel. I reached out to her hometown, a small city a few hours away, and asked about her background. What I found was more than a little concerning. Helen's first husband, Richard Boyd, had also died under strange circumstances, drowned in a lake on a weekend camping trip. The incident had been ruled an accident, but there were whispers, stories from people who knew Richard and Helen. Some claimed that the couple had been on the verge of separation, while others mentioned that Richard's family suspected something foul, but couldn't prove it. When Helen inherited a sizable life insurance payout, she left town, moved to Oakwood, and within a year married Daniel Grayson. The similarities between Richard's death and Daniel's were too much to ignore. Both were well-off men who trusted her implicitly, and both were gone, leaving her with substantial financial gain. I felt a chill run down my spine. Had Helen orchestrated not just one but two accidental deaths? But I needed more. Rumors and suspicions wouldn't be enough to build a case, especially against someone as composed and poised as Helen. I would need hard evidence, something that tied her directly to Daniel's death. So I retraced my steps, going over every detail from that night. The staircase, the bruising, the strange calm in Helen's voice when she reported his fall. I decided to talk to Daniel's friends and family, hoping someone might have noticed something that could give us a clearer picture of his final days. The more I uncovered, the more unsettling the story became. Daniel had been distant, distracted. He'd confided in his brother about something that didn't feel right at home, but had brushed it off as stress. Whatever had been haunting Daniel before his death, I was determined to find it. And as I went back through those case files, I knew I was getting closer to the truth. Join me next time as we delve into Daniel's personal life and uncover the secrets he kept hidden, secrets that may have cost him everything. As I delved deeper into the life Helen and Daniel shared, more troubling details began to surface. The financial irregularities were one thing, but there was something even more disturbing, a pattern of control and manipulation that hinted at deeper issues in their relationship. I tracked down Daniel's accountant, hoping he might shed some light on the discrepancies in the finances. When I asked if Daniel had expressed concerns, he nodded. He was worried, Detective. Said he'd noticed funds missing from a joint account. But here's the strange part. He didn't want to confront Helen about it. He just asked me to watch for more activity. It was as if he already suspected her but wasn't ready to admit it. That statement hit me hard. Daniel had trusted Helen enough to share his life and wealth with her. But there were cracks in that trust. Cracks that had been growing in the months leading up to his death. And if he hadn't confronted her, it raised another question. Did Helen know he was watching her? Was she aware of his suspicions? I began interviewing people close to the couple, looking for any sign of tension. Daniel's friends described him as quiet but intense, a man who bottled up his worries until he couldn't anymore. His colleague Maria mentioned that just days before his death, Daniel had confided in her. He'd said, "I think I've made a mistake, Maria. I've trusted someone too much." When she pressed him, he waved it off, dismissing it as paranoia. But the words were haunting now. I returned to the Grayson estate one night, walking through the empty rooms, imagining the life they had built together. It was eerie how spotless everything was, almost as if No one had really lived there. And yet, in the bedroom, I found something. A small drawer locked in a nightstand by the bed. I picked the lock, and inside I found a notebook. It was Daniel's handwriting, a journal of sorts. As I thumbed through the pages, I felt a chill run down my spine. He'd written entries about feeling watched, about noticing things missing or moved around the house, about his growing suspicion that Helen was hiding something from him. The last entry was dated the night before he died. It read, "I can't trust her. I need to confront her, but I'm afraid of what I'll find." This journal painted a picture of a man trapped between love and fear, a man who felt betrayed by the person he trusted most. It was becoming clear that the Grayson marriage wasn't just troubled, it was dangerous. Now, the question wasn't just if Helen was hiding something, but what she was capable of, and I had a feeling I was about to find out. Stay tuned as we unearth the secrets in that journal and discover what Daniel was so afraid of. With Daniel's journal in hand, I felt like I was holding a piece of his life. A raw, honest account of his fears, his suspicions, and the emotional turmoil he'd been facing in silence. As I read on, the entries took a darker turn, pulling me deeper into the disturbing reality of Daniel's final days. One of the first things that struck me was how isolated he'd felt. In one entry, he wrote, "There's no one I can talk to about this. No one would believe me, not even Robert. Helen's too good at hiding things. She makes it seem like I'm the crazy one." He felt trapped, manipulated, as if Helen were deliberately keeping him on edge. It was a classic pattern I'd seen in emotionally abusive relationships, a gradual erosion of confidence, leaving the victim questioning their own sanity. But there was something even more chilling. Daniel mentioned noticing things being moved around in the house, items missing, and then reappearing in odd places. He'd tried asking Helen, but she'd simply laughed it off, calling him paranoid. At first, he believed her, but as the weeks went on, the disturbances became more frequent and more threatening. One entry, written just a few days before his death, was particularly haunting. "Last night, I heard footsteps outside our bedroom door. I called out to Helen, but she didn't respond. When I got up to check, no one was there. But this morning, I found my wedding ring lying in the kitchen sink. I haven't taken it off in years. How did it get there?" I could almost picture Daniel sitting alone in that big, empty house, feeling watched, feeling his grip on reality slipping. And the worst part was that he couldn't escape it, not without confronting the woman he thought he loved. My instincts told me that Helen was behind this psychological warfare, chipping away at him slowly. But without proof, these were just suspicions. I needed more than Daniel's accounts if I was going to take Helen down. That's when I received a tip from an unexpected source, one of Helen's former neighbors. Apparently, Helen had confided in her a few months before Daniel's death, mentioning that he had become difficult and that she was worried about him. She'd even suggested that he was becoming a danger to himself. The pieces were falling into place. Helen was setting the stage, creating a narrative of instability. If Daniel had died in a way that looked like suicide or an accident, it would have fit the story she'd planted with her friends. But it hadn't gone exactly as planned. He had fallen down the stairs, yes. But was it really an accident? This wasn't just a tragic accident or a simple crime. It was calculated, a web of deceit woven so tightly that Daniel's death almost seemed inevitable. But there were still questions left unanswered. Why had Helen waited so long? What had triggered her to act now? In the next chapter, we'll uncover a shocking discovery that sheds light on Helen's true motivations and the lengths she was willing to go to achieve her goal. Stay tuned, because this story is about to take an unexpected twist. As I dug deeper, a former neighbor came forward with a haunting memory. Helen had once confided in her, hinting that Daniel had changed and seemed off. At first, this didn't catch my attention, but as I listened, the narrative shifted. Helen had slowly planted seeds of doubt about Daniel's mental health, making casual remarks that, over time, framed him as disturbed, even dangerous. This careful manipulation, I realized, started long before Daniel's death, months, if not years in the making. It was clear she wanted to paint a picture of an unsteady man, one whose tragic end might appear inevitable. The precision with which she shaped this perception was chilling. I could see her carefully sewing this image of Daniel one piece at a time, always just enough to leave an impression, never enough to raise alarms. It was a disturbing level of control, like an artist designing a tragic end on her own terms. Then I went back to analyze the last few conversations Helen had with Daniel's close friends. Their accounts revealed that Daniel had recently spoken of feeling confused, almost as if he were losing his grip on reality. He believed Helen was manipulating him, twisting his words, gaslighting him. His friends remembered the helplessness in his voice, the uncertainty that plagued him in his final days. This was Helen's narrative, a slow, cruel erosion of Daniel's sanity, building over time. She was orchestrating his downfall, making it look like it was all his doing, like his tragic end was his tragic flaw. The irony was bitter, and it stung. Daniel's descent was no accident. It was a tale crafted by Helen herself. She had played everyone, even him, with chilling precision. As I sifted through Daniel's possessions, hoping to find even a small clue, something unexpected emerged. Hidden away in a locked drawer in Daniel's office was a series of journals. They weren't ordinary entries. Each page was an attempt to make sense of the growing confusion he felt. His writings revealed a man tormented by manipulation. Daniel noted moments where Helen contradicted him on events he knew had happened, erasing memories and reshaping conversations, leaving him questioning his own sanity. In one entry, Daniel recounted a night he claimed Helen had never come home, only for her to insist she'd been there the whole time. He wrote about how he felt he was losing pieces of himself, as if his life were a puzzle she kept taking apart and rearranging at will. The torment seeped through every line of his entries. And yet, he held on to love for her, excusing her behavior, blaming himself. His mind was unraveling, and Helen was there every step, pulling the threads tighter. But there was something else. At the very back of the journal, almost as if written as an afterthought, was a note that stopped me cold. It read, "If anything happens to me, it was her." A final plea, a whisper of a truth that Daniel feared would be buried with him. But why didn't he ever go to the police? Why did he keep this horror hidden? It was a question that would drive me deeper into the darkest parts of this case. My next discovery turned everything on its head. Tucked away in Helen's file was a copy of Daniel's will. In it, I found something disturbing. Just months before his death, Daniel had changed the beneficiary of his life insurance policy. Originally left to his sister, a woman who had been his only family for years, it was now directed entirely to Helen. And that's not all. Daniel had never made this change. The will was forged. Helen's touch was evident, her handwriting skillfully mimicking his signature. I brought this to my legal contact, who confirmed that the document had likely been tampered with, but Helen had covered her tracks well. The financial gain she stood to receive from his death was substantial, enough to raise questions. Could it be the motive? It was starting to look like it. Money, control, and the finality of a rewritten will were pieces of a carefully laid plan. This case was slipping into darker, more sinister depths. The realization dawned on me. Helen had not only orchestrated his mental demise, but had plotted a way to profit from his death. This wasn't just a broken relationship. This was a methodical, calculated takedown. After days of scanning through security footage, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A camera at a nearby store had captured Helen entering the home at a time she claimed she was elsewhere. There she was, looking around, scanning for anyone who might see her, before slipping inside. This footage was our golden ticket, proof that she had lied about her whereabouts on the night of Daniel's death. But why lie? The footage suggested a clear intent to avoid being seen, and that was enough to bring Helen back in for questioning. As I confronted her with the footage, she barely flinched. Her gaze remained cold, calculating, as if I were merely an obstacle in her path. She continued to deny any involvement, spinning stories that grew more tangled with each lie. But the walls were closing in, and even Helen knew it. Armed with the surveillance footage, the forged will, and Daniel's haunting journal entries, we brought Helen in for a final interview. I sat across from her, laying each piece of evidence on the table, watching as her confidence began to erode. I could see her steely resolve slipping moment by moment until finally she cracked. Her confession was chilling. Helen admitted to manipulating Daniel's mind, planting seeds of self-doubt, using his love for her as a weapon. It wasn't just about money, though she admitted greed played its part. This was about control, a twisted satisfaction in watching someone unravel, in bending another's life to her will. Her confession left the room in silence, the weight of her words lingering like smoke. The case against Helen was airtight. The evidence painted a clear picture of manipulation, betrayal, and greed. Daniel's family, devastated by the truth, stood by as the verdict was read, their relief mixed with grief. Helen was sentenced, her cold demeanor never faltering as she was led away. Justice had been served, but at a heavy cost. The reality of Daniel's suffering and the extent of Helen's manipulation haunted us all. After the case was closed, I spent nights reflecting on what we'd uncovered. This wasn't just a crime of passion or opportunity. It was a calculated, deliberate plot to dismantle a person's life. The ruthlessness of Helen's manipulation left me unsettled, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones closest to us. Daniel's story became a haunting example of how fragile trust can be, and how easily it can be twisted into something dark. This case taught me the importance of listening to even the faintest of warnings, the subtle signs that something might be amiss. Daniel had felt these signs, sensed the manipulation, but doubt had silenced his voice. His story is a reminder that intuition is powerful. Ignoring it can sometimes come at the highest cost. It's crucial that we recognize the importance of speaking out and seeking help, no matter how small our suspicions may seem. As an investigator, I've seen stories like Daniel's unfold in countless ways, each time leaving a mark. If there's one thing I want my listeners to take away, it's this. Trust your instincts, protect your mental well-being, and seek support when something feels wrong. Sometimes the most dangerous criminals hide behind a friendly face, and it's up to us to safeguard ourselves against even those we think we know best.